Well, a very good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. My name is Adrian Reed, and a very, very warm welcome to this evening's BA Community webinar. Now, this is a topic that I was really, really pleased that we're able to cover, because I suspect all of us as BAs are involved in running, facilitating, arranging workshops. And it's sometimes hard to get people to engage, or even if we can get people to engage, when there are lots of workshops, sometimes it's difficult to find fun and innovative ways of keeping people really interested. And as good as post-it notes are, when you've come out of the sort of 30th workshop with post-it notes, it can become a little bit samey. So I'm really pleased to say we'll be discussing, well, sort of visualization, we'll be discussing gamification and storytelling, three really important topics. And we're going to be talking about how to make workshops from good workshops to great workshops. So I'm really pleased to say we have two fantastic guests with us tonight. So we have Grant Wright and Paddy Dhanda. So Grant, I've known Grant for a few years now. Grant is Principal Consultant and Director of Scarlett Solutions, very much into business analysis, architecture, agile product management and business transformation. But you will probably know Grant most for the awesome visuals he does at conferences, and he's done some at these webinars and has posted them online, which I'm always really, really grateful for. So, really, really pleased you could be on the webinar today, Grant. And we also have Paddy Dhanda, and Paddy is the Agile Practice Director at QA Limited. He's done all sorts of training in the past, speaks internationally on all sorts of interesting sorts of topics. And I know, Paddy, you're going to talk a little bit more about your background in one of the sort of visualization sections, so I won't spoil that bit too much. But Paddy, thank you very much for being with us today as well. So fantastic.
Thank you, Adrian.
Great. Okay, so if you are attending live, do remember you can ask questions at any time. We've got a few things we're going to be talking about, but you can interject at any point. Also, if you are attending live, I'm just going to pop a quick link in the chat window. Just bear with me. So what I'm putting in there is a link to a shared Jamboard. Now, if you've been on one of these webinars before, you'll be familiar with this, but if you haven't, the Jamboard looks like this. So you'll see there are some sticky notes on there. What I'd ask you do if you're attending live is when you hear something that's really interesting that you want to record, add a sticky note. So you can write your top topics on there, and you can move them around, and you might even want to start you can draw on there if you've got a graphics pen or whatever. So it's a good way of sort of collectively taking notes along the way, and we'll bring that back in about halfway through the session. So fantastic. Okay, so let's get going. So first of all, one of the topics that we're going to talk about is visual thinking. So a question that I'll put to, well, maybe I'll start with Grant, is what do we mean by visual thinking?
Yeah, so I've been having to think about this, and I thought a good way to illustrate what visual thinking is maybe to try and practice visual thinking in my explanation.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I was going to share my screen.
Absolutely.
And see how this goes. Can you see my piece of paper in my hand?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. I'm going to have a go at this. I've kind of prepared an idea, and hopefully it'll take about 15 minutes or so, but give me a nudge if I'm running over time, Adrian, because I will waffle on if not. So let me get going. So what I'm going to do, can you see what I'm drawing here as I'm doing it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, nice and legible. So what I'm doing here is drawing pencil, because we're talking about visual thinking. And more often than not, when we're talking about visual thinking, we're talking about the idea of hand-drawn images that are designed to create engagement and interest. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a visual thinking journey, which I'm trying to represent with this pathway here. And irrespective of the way in which you're practicing visual thinking, I think I was trying to think what have all the different visual thinking practices kind of got in common? And I came to the conclusion that the common theme in all of the visual thinking methods I can think of and have practiced is they help us to gain clarity in what we're doing. And I'm going to explore 4 different aspects of visual thinking, all of which provide clarity in different ways. Okay? So I'm going to talk about how visual thinking helps us to understand and do my best to practice what I preach and not try and go too quickly, otherwise you start to panic. The second area is the idea of using visual thinking to explore ideas. In order to collaborate and co-create with others. The next one I'm going to talk about is using visual thinking to help with learning and recall of information. And the last one I'm going to talk about is using visualization to help improve how we communicate. And that could be communicating our knowledge to others, explaining the ideas that we've explored, painting a picture of a vision, whatever it might be. So those are the 4 areas that I'm going to cover. With me so far? Okay, so quite often when we're using visual thinking in a context such as this, we're trying to build ideas and understanding that people can kind of recognize and resonate with. So one great way to do that is to use the idea of a metaphor. So I don't know if you can kind of see what I'm doing here, work out what it is, but I'm trying to draw some kind of boat. So I'm turning my pencil into a boat that's going to go on some kind of voyage. And there you go, I've got a little pirate ship there. And I've got my pirate on the lookout for our destination towards clarity, okay? And just to reinforce the idea that this is, you know, the visual thinking and visualization, stick an eye on the middle just to make it a bit more interesting, obvious what we're talking about. Now, at the start of our journey, I'm going to explore how you can use visualization in the kind of a sense-making space. So how do you explore ideas and create understanding and use visualization to help you with that? As we move through our journey, I'm going to talk more about how, right, we've explored things, we've acquired some knowledge, so how do I actually use and apply that knowledge and use visuals to help with that process? Okay? So roughly speaking, kind of going from sense making to better understanding and how visuals can be used in both. The topic we're talking about is kind of more in this bottom half. It's more in creating the shared understanding and exploring ideas, but equally when you're communicating things in the workshop, some of this can come in there as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk through each of these now, but before I do that, to hammer home my metaphor, I'm going to draw a little treasure box up here. So this is my pirate's treasure at the end of our visual thinking journey, if you like. There's some different treasure items in there, they're all sparkling. And I'm going to represent that as being something that's sat on a desert island with a coconut tree to make it obvious. And I've got some sea and waves around the edge of that. And just to frame it so I can tell the story where I want to, I've got a bit of scenery in the background there, and just to kind of give you that feel for the journey we're going on. Okay, so I've finished trying to create my metaphoric landscape, and now I'm going to talk about each aspect of visual thinking on that journey. The first bit is, if I draw something horrible and squiggly like this, I'm trying to represent complexity or some kind of messy problem that we're trying to solve, which, Adrian, I know you know all well about in your systems thinking descriptions and workshops. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to take that complexity, and I'm going to use the analogy of a cotton reel, where we want to create that kind of sense of order and simplify it. So what visual thinking allows us to do is it allows us to explore these complex, messy problems and externalize our thinking in order to simplify our understanding. And we do that by taking what's in our mind's eye, our kind of private mental models, and making them public. And by transforming what's in our head to what's outside of our head onto a piece of paper, we've kind of made things that were previously, hidden and kind of tacit knowledge and assumptions that are in a workshop. And we've flipped it on its head. We've made information visible externally, and we've started to make information and assumptions explicit in what we've done. So we've changed the dynamic of the conversation just by externalizing our thoughts. And that holds true whether you're in a workshop in a group context, or actually if you're doing this just for your own benefit and you're thinking through your ideas. I often just download information visually to try and get my head around a problem. So that's kind of the first aspect. And what that allows us to do is to then kind of pull together the view of, well, what are the different elements of the problem we're trying to solve, and what are the potential connections between them, in order to allow us to form kind of a systems model and a view and an understanding that we can then gravitate around and explore. So that's kind of the first aspect. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next one. The next one around exploring needs. So the idea in this one, I thought, was showing that somebody who's maybe stood at a whiteboard and they're facilitating maybe a workshop discussion or something like that. So I'll kind of draw a big canvas or a whiteboard, and maybe, like Adrian said earlier, they're putting post-its on and externalising their thoughts, and that's good. But what's better is if we've got other people there and they're also involved, and even better than that, they're not just up on their feet, they're actually, grabbing a post-it themselves and putting their thoughts on the wall as well. And then we start to get people it's supposed to be somebody scratching their head. They're starting to think more about the problem because they can kind of see the connections that are going on. And by doing it this way, you're kind of using the visualization to explore connections, and you're inviting participation. And what that brings to the table is the idea of kind of diversity of perspective. And everybody's getting a voice by working this way. If you're just doing a workshop where you're running it in a kind of traditional way, and you quite often get the loudest person wins, and you listen to their voice. So this opens up that kind of diversity angle. And then what's interesting is then somebody else can come along who's kind of interested in what this group are doing, and they see what's being discussed, and because they can kind of see the thought process, because it's explicit, they're looking at the board and thinking, oh, that's interesting, then they can start to say, oh yeah, I've got an idea that is kind of similar to that, and they can bring their idea into the conversation. Okay, so those are the kind of the primary areas in that sense making, understanding, exploring. In terms of learning and recall, I'll touch upon this briefly, but what I had in my mind here was the stuff that you talked about, Adrian, that I sometimes do on your webinars, which is for me to get the most out of them. I sit there and I sketch note what I'm hearing. You know, I draw pictures and words and combine them to help me get my head around what I'm hearing. So, you know, this can be used if you've kind of got verbal information, maybe you've read an interesting article, maybe you've listened to one of Paddy's fantastic podcasts, and you want to remember what you heard, or maybe you're watching one of Adrian's YouTube broadcasts or something like that. But in all these have in common is you're taking information that's delivered, often in a linear verbal way, and you're creating the relationships in the same way I've described down here, but you're kind of doing it for your own benefit. So this is where sketchnoting kind of fits into the picture. And I'd also add in there graphic recording or scribing. To me, they're very similar. It's just the scale in which you're doing it, and typically graphic recording would be done in a wider scale environment, and not just for the benefit of the person who's taking the notes personally, but to share with others and create that group understanding. And ultimately, however you've output that information, what that does is it helps you to recall and remember that information. If you've put pen to paper and visualize something, I can speak to my own experience. I remember, Adrian, you doing a talk on systems thinking, and I remember it vividly because I took the time to draw it, and I did that after the event, but you know, that's a great example where I remember the stuff that I've kind of put down.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking that. I mean, I love the way you've described that, Grant, and it's interesting because also, I mean, this probably bleeds into the storytelling, because actually, you know, what you were doing there had an element of story to it. You know, you've got the sort of journey there. But one question I suspect some people will have is, what about like drawing if you don't feel like you're an artist? Because I mean, I know from your sketches, Grant, that you've really developed your visual skills. Do you think that like we have to have great visual skills to use visualization, or can you just like get up onto a whiteboard, or you know, a real or virtual whiteboard and draw?
I think that drawing in a business context is a skill that can be learned. So I think it's a myth that you have to be an artist to be able to think visually. You know, I've drawn there an audience listening to a presentation. What I've really done is I've drawn a bunch of U's and O's and squares. There's nothing complicated about that. I think you do have to put in a bit of time and practice to learn the tricks, and there's plenty of resources out there to be able to do that. But once you learn how to represent objects, and then you start to think, well, I want to represent something that's more of an activity or something more of an emotion, that's more abstract, and you start to come across different ideas and metaphors. And I think once you know how to do the basic drawing and write legibly, which is important, I don't think there's that much of a barrier to then piece it together. And I think it just becomes a confidence thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I spent most of my time practicing this for my own benefit, not showing anybody, and then eventually started sharing it or introducing it piecemeal into the work that I do. And then I guess the more you do it, and then people see it, and then they start asking for that to be brought to the table because they saw the benefit. So that's how it's grown for me. I didn't just turn up one day and thought, right, I'm gonna visually do a workshop. It just, you know, it's evolved. But also I think that helps you test the water in the organisation as to how to introduce it as well.
Yeah, and that leads us, we've got some questions rolling in, and that leads us to a question from Lisa. And Lisa asks whether you can give examples of where you'd use this kind of visual thinking in a real, you know, in a real sort of office or business use case. So can you give some examples of where you've used this kind of visualization?
Yes, so I think I think in a recent, really practical example for BAs is I was working with a client, and we were working on a pension administration platform, but it was for a bunch of foreign policies that had been acquired, so there wasn't the cost benefit to put it into their main systems. So we had to try and visualize an end-to-end solution that would work but wouldn't be kind of a Rolls Royce. And we had a discussion about it, and we said, well, maybe they could use a spreadsheet to do this bit, and then we'd have an MI report that would do that. And I didn't do it live in that situation, but what I did, because we were working remotely, is I did a sketch on my whiteboard behind me, and then I had a chat with the guy who was kind of leading the discussion, and I just took a picture and said, did I understand that right? And he looked at it and said, well, yeah, but actually, now I've seen that, there's probably a bit missing. There's probably this bit which we didn't talk about in the session, but we added it in. And then I kind of shared that with a couple of other people, and the lead architect on the project said, this is really useful. Can you know, but it was a bit scruffy. So can you almost like redraw it so we can present it to the wider working group?
Yeah.
And we used it to introduce, it was almost like a context diagram. It wasn't the formal context diagram model, but it was just showing the big blocks, almost like a rich picture that helped people just understand what we were trying to do, and where we were looking for automation or not. So that's a good example of where I've used it.
Definitely. No, fantastic, Grant. And that element of filling in the gaps also resonates with what you were saying earlier about making the implicit explicit and understanding mental models. So we'll just cover up another couple of questions before we move on to the next topic. And Paddy, chime in here, because with these, you might have a view on these two as well.
Yeah.
Rushma asked, whilst we are working remotely, what drawing tools can you suggest that can be shared over MS Teams? So either Paddy or Grant, any suggestions on remote drawing tools?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in with a couple, and then I know Grant knows a hell of a lot on this as well. So I guess for me, I started off with lots of digital fancy tools. I was trying to figure out how could I best draw digitally and project it over some kind of video conferencing tool. But what I ended up with was actually going back to pen and paper. So I normally have a separate webcam, just a bit like Grant's got now, and kind of live sketch. So I often find that gives it that really authentic feel to people. And it just allows you to, make mistakes. So, people can see that you don't have to be brilliant at drawing. It gives you that kind of authenticity. However, there's another really cool app I would recommend anybody that has an iPad to try this app out. It's called Sketchbook Pro, I think it's called, or Sketchpad Pro, sorry. Sketchpad Pro. It's about £20. And what it allows you to do is you can doodle anything on your iPad, and you simply go to a URL on any web browser, and you can see what you're doodling. So there's no plugins, there's no download required, because I know a lot of corporate networks kind of lock that down. So that's been phenomenal. So that's a great app.
Fantastic. Any to add, Grant, to that list?
So I didn't actually know you could do that with that tool, Paddy, so I'm interested. I'm going to look that one up myself. I mean, like Paddy said, I'm using an iPivot document camera here, which is like £100 or something off Amazon. It's more than fit for purpose. But I also use my iPad if I want to create a digital image or do something a bit more polished. So I use a couple of apps. I use an app called Paper by WeTransfer, which is it's relatively basic, but it's quite accessible. So it's a good entry app. And then for more advanced stuff where you need layers and things like that and masking, I use Procreate.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so we've got more questions coming in. We will try and take a few more as the session progresses, but I do want to move on now to the next topic. And so we've talked a little bit about sort of visualization and visual thinking there. So I want to talk about storytelling. And what I'd like to talk about initially is what do you, I guess storytelling could mean many different things to different people. So what I'm interested in is what you mean by storytelling and why it's important. And Paddy, I think you've probably got a perspective on that.
Sure, thanks, Adrian. So I guess if I could see everybody and you're all in a room and I asked for a show of hands, and if I said, how many of us would rather watch their favorite TV series versus listening to their CEO giving you another pep talk about, how we're going to change our strategy? I'm pretty sure most of us would put up our hands saying they'd rather watch the TV series. And if we think about, how many times have we ever seen anyone burst into tears or laugh out loud when they've been looking at a spreadsheet, right? I'm sure that's happened to some people, but it's not something that often happens. So I guess if we think about sort of storytelling and the power of storytelling, what it allows us to do is it allows us to really connect with our emotions. And so if we think about the work context, often at work, we get lots of messages and things like facts and figures, and we try and order them into a logical structure. That type of information, it sort of activates our sort of language processing zone of the brain, right? So there's kind of some science behind that. And that's very much about the mind. But if we want to unlock some of the other elements, as I mentioned, the emotional side, what we find is through stories, we can really get to the heart. And just by telling a story that has some emotion in there, we perhaps talk a little bit about some of the senses. It helps us actually unlock about 7 different zones of the brain. So that includes the language processing part, but also our image processing part of the brain, our emotions, our senses like touch, smell, etc. So I think, storytelling is really powerful. And I'm sure if we can think of a talk that we remember from history, it's usually those that have some form of story in there. So if we know it's really powerful, we know it's something that we find really interesting, then why not bring it into our business context? And that's something that I've been experimenting with quite a bit recently. I'm not going to say I'm an expert on it, but I think it really just adds another dimension to a presentation or a talk or even a meeting. So I'll go through an example in a second, but Adrian, just let me know if you want to sort of pick up any other questions before I do that.
Yeah, absolutely, will do.
Yep. Okay, so let me jump over then, see if this works. Hey, it worked. Okay, I was fearing my technology was going to let me down. So again, sort of taking some of the great sort of visuals that Grant sort of drew there. To be honest, I didn't want you to stop, Grant. It was amazing just watching you. So I've been sort of experimenting a little bit with the visuals, but the storytelling element. And this is something I've done with clients recently. So I don't know about you, but often when we meet new people and you're in a meeting and you have about 10 other people on the call, we do a round of introductions. I don't know about you, but I rarely remember like more than 3 points about anybody's background. So I've been experimenting with taking a storytelling approach. So if I just sort of go through what I sometimes do. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit more about me, about my career, where I started. So I guess when I was young, and I'm talking about the era of Thundercats, He-Man, She-Ra, Muppet Babies, I don't know, Grant and
no
Adrian.
Idea what you're talking about. I've never heard of them.
Yeah, you're talking my language, right? Yeah. Any others you guys can remember of that sort of era? Although my kids kind of look at me as if I'm sort of, talking some other language. But back then, during that sort of early part of my life, I literally had a pen in my hand or a pencil in my hand, and I used to draw anything that I could see. I used to constantly be drawing all the time. And then as I sort of grew up, I took art quite seriously. I did a GCSE, and then my art teacher told me, she said, you must do art. It's something that you must do. She felt that I had something creative in me. And so I chose it at A-level. And I went to college, and in my very first lesson, I got freaked out. I got freaked out in my first A-level art class. and I dropped the subject, and I never ever touched it again. And I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to the reason why. So just hold that thought for a second. But in terms of my career, I guess then, you know, as sort of, I graduated, I joined British Telecom, I became a programmer, and then I really found my feet with business analysis. Business analysis became my passion. It allowed me to talk to lots of people, allowed me to really understand lots of different areas of a business. And then I moved more into kind of product ownership. Then I put on a suit and I pretended I knew all of the answers, and I joined IBM as a consultant. And during my time at IBM, I was involved in probably the biggest agile failure anywhere on the planet. And I sometimes refer to it as £2 billion worth of agile failures. And the majority of that was with IBM when I was working on the Universal Credit Program. So if you want to know how not to do agile, just Google that. Then I joined Deutsche Bank. And so you see, I'm sort of heading towards the planet over here. So as I kind of build up my sort of sort of story of my life, I joined Deutsche Bank initially in a delivery role, but then I got into learning, and I met the most phenomenal lady, Gabby the Texan. Gabby Patrick became my manager, and she was absolutely amazing, and she really introduced me to a lot of these techniques around storytelling, etc. But really got me to realize when I was running training sessions that actually what people really want to hear is something about you. They want to remember you as a presenter. They can literally go to anybody and talk to them about agile or business analysis, and anyone with knowledge can give them that knowledge. But actually, people prefer to connect to the trainer or the presenter. And so I remember at one of my sessions, Gabby pulled me up afterwards and she said, "How did you feel that went for you? How did you feel that training session went for you?" And I thought I did okay. I thought it went pretty well. And she turned around and she went, "Well, that was pathetic." And it was appalling. And she literally just kind of slapped me in the face. And some of the reasoning behind that was, she said to me, you talk about your Punjabi and you have this Indian heritage, but she said none of that came out. None of that came out in that talk. And you could have been just anybody off the street, and none of the audience will ever remember anything about you as a person. So ever since then, I started to bring more of my personal side into presenting. And at Deutsche Bank, I was fortunate enough to help train, I think we trained over 20,000 people in all. So it got me to really practice some of this stuff, which was really cool. And then more recently, I joined QA. So QA, the training organization. And there I do sort of agile coaching and agile training. But and that's all the kind of the boring stuff. So I'm going to come back to this moment here. Why did I get so freaked out? Why did I drop art and never touch it again? Well, in my very first art class, there was a naked man that we had to draw in the room. And I was quite an introvert back then. And it just freaked me out. And I wasn't prepared for that. I mean, it could have been a naked woman. It doesn't really matter about the gender, but it was this fact that I'm going to go to art and I'm going to have to draw naked people. It just didn't sit right with me at the time. So it just totally freaked me out and I dropped the subject. But I'll stop there before I get myself in trouble and talk about it.
That sounds like a fantastic art class to me.
That's just a little bit about me. There we go.
Excellent. So, well, that was a memorable story that had a twist in it that I wasn't expecting, Paddy. So I'm never going to forget that. And
so there will be a test on that at the end, Adrian. We'll drop in a few questions and say what do we remember from that story. But we'll say that.
So what I was wondering, because I mean I love the way that you laid that out, and I love the way you sort of combined it with visual thinking there in a way, because you were using the sort of visualization as we went along, which again I find for me helps me remember. But I was wondering, are you able to give some examples of how you've used that in workshops, or how we might use that storytelling, whether or not it's combined with visual thinking in a workshop?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question, Adrian, because just going back to this point about, do you have to be good at art to be able to do this stuff? Well, actually, you saw there an example of where I'd pre-prepared everything. So, when we're sort of putting ourselves in that position of presenting, and then having to draw live, like, you know, I think that takes a certain amount of mastery and certain amount of practice, right? So Grant is absolutely phenomenal. Was I brave enough to draw all of that as I was talking and also do it at the speed at which I was going to be talking? Probably not. So I think you can pre-prepare a lot of things. So if you know there's going to be, you know, certain stories that you want to retell, use again and again, why not pre-prepare that stuff? Right. And you know, I would always recommend that. But in terms of where I've used this, recently I was coaching a lady who's going to write a blog on the session, actually, which would be awesome. But I was coaching a young lady who we came right to the end of our coaching engagement, and I wanted to do a little bit of a retrospective for her, and for her to then continue her journey. And I use this exact same visual. So the one I just showed in terms of the tree going up to the mountains, to the sun, to the moon, we use that exact same visual. And what I got her to do was shout out the different elements of what she had learned through the coaching engagement. And I was actually putting the Post-its on the visual as we went along. And we just built this story up for her. And then I said, well, what are you going to do next? How are you going to get to the moon? What's your next step? And she brainstormed a whole load of ideas, but it was used as a coaching tool to help her structure her sort of her thinking around it. So absolutely, I think, you know, it's really powerful. And beyond that, in training sort of sessions, I've taught things like Scrum, you know, frameworks, through telling a story about a character who goes through on a little adventure.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you also think about, I mean, there are creative thinking tools about, well, you know, let's imagine a year's time in a really positive future state and how we got there, and a really negative state and what inhibited us getting there and the difference, and actually drawing those sorts of stories out. So I'll just...
That's an interesting one, just to jump in there, Adrian. Like earlier today, somebody pinged me an email. It was an article on the BBC, and it was a story envisaging a near future state of going back into the office after COVID, but how the world's different. So it was like, here's Martha, and she's getting up at 7 o'clock because people are staggering when they're going into work, and then she turns up and it's got facial recognition, so she doesn't have to touch any doors. And it was just telling the story of what the future work could look like, but it also had visuals when you were scrolling down the article that reinforced messages. So it was doing both. It was storytelling and using the visuals to reinforce that. And you can use that when you're driving through business change and transformation, or you're looking at user experience and trying to map out an understanding of the customer journey, those kind of things as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess a customer journey itself is part visualization, part storytelling. So, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, when you abstract it away. So I just want to take a few questions, then we'll have a look at what's happening on the Jamboard, which is always terrifying because I've got it on my other screen over there, but I'm not really seeing what's happening on it. So we'll cover as many as we can quickly before we move on to the next topic. So Alexandra asks, do you have any recommendations for resources to learn practical sketch drawing for beginners?
Yeah, I've got lots. I'm trying to think where to start. I started with the Sketchnote Handbook by Mike Rodey, who was a guest. Paddy and I run a meetup called the Visual Jam, and Mike kindly agreed to be our first guest on that. And that's a fantastic book. It's easily accessible, so I'd recommend that one as a starting point. Yeah, Paddy, there was one you mentioned the other day that was like an entry level one.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to let you carry on talking for a second, Grant. I'm going to grab it. Yeah, it might be better if I do that. So just give me a second.
That's fine. I've got another one right in front of me that I can show you. So that this one's, can you see that? Osmo, Thinking with Your Pen by Martin Houseman. This one is a bit more advanced, but but it does start with the basics. But this covers so much. This is unbelievable how much content's in this book. I'd recommend that one if you're really interested.
Did you find the book, Paddy?
I did. I found a couple. So yep, absolutely. We've got The Art of Visual Note Taking.
That was the one I was thinking of, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. I better stay in focus, otherwise it kind of goes. And I'll put the names and everything on afterwards. But this one's by a lady called Emily Mills. So that's Emily Mills. The other really good one I would say is Visual Thinking which is this kind of, there we go, he's got it as well.
You both agree.
Yeah, and also the red one as well. There's a second one to it as well. It's got it there as well. So those are two really, really cool books, I would say.
So lots of resources there, and of course your visual jam is another resource that people should tap into. So we then have Penny, our good mutual friend Penny, who says Penny Pullen here. I use this all the time and have done for years. Interestingly, I've learned that recently that this sort of stuff works really well with the brain, as it's novel and also rather fun. Just been doing a neuroscience program, and it's been fascinating, reinforcing what I've found over the years. And in terms of resources, actually, Penny has an online website you can sign up to. I think it's called, I'm going to get it wrong, Penny. If I get it wrong, please put it in the Q&A. I'll read it out. I think it's called Graphics Made Easy or Graphics Made Simple. I'm sorry, Penny, if I've said it wrong. But you can type it in the chat, and I'll read it out. But that's really useful as well. And Penny's stuff is always fantastic. Lisa, when you were drawing, Grant, Lisa said, "Love the shadow." Which
I carried on. I can't help myself. I've got to add the shadow and a bit of colour. I'll show you at the end. I've finished.
Fantastic. And very quickly, Hayley says, "Have you had any experience with Microsoft Whiteboard for this purpose, as in the drawing and visualization?"
So I haven't, but I'm working with a client at the moment who are evaluating it for exactly that purpose. So I can't tell you now because I haven't used it myself yet, but we are looking at it.
Yeah. Okay. And Ara asks, if you draw on an iPad, do you use your finger or a tool like a stylus?
No, I use a stylus. I've got it to hand. In 2 seconds, I can reach it. Yeah, so I've got the Apple Pencil, and then what I found was quite good was there was I won't be able to show you. It's like a screen protector. It's called Paper-like. I think that's right. And you put it on like you would an ordinary screen protector, and it creates like a friction, so it doesn't feel like you're drawing on glass.
Right.
I always didn't get along with, so it just gives you a bit more resistance, like you would with the actual paper. So that took a bit of getting used to, but that's really good.
Fantastic. I'm
just going to say on the stylus, I've traditionally used the Apple Pencil, but I was finding the battery life on it was a little bit dodgy for me, and now they've actually come up with lots of third-party styluses that are equally as good. I've found. I ordered one the other day, and again, I can share the links when we send out the email, but it's actually phenomenal, and it's only like a fraction of the cost of a pencil, so it was around £25. So.
Fantastic. And I've just noticed that Penny has put the URL in the Q&A, which I've now put into the chat. It's graphicsmadeeasy.co.uk. It's a sort of 3-month online course, and definitely worth checking out as well. So now let's see what's happening on the Jamboard. And this is always terrifying because I can see it out the corner of my eye. I can see there's stuff on it. And let's have a bit of a gander. So we have, we've got visual thinking, clarity, collaboration, stories help us connect with the emotion. We're bombarded with figures at work. Somebody's drawn themselves. That's amazing. That's fantastic. Sketchnoting, graphic recording, make the tacit explicit. People are getting quite a lot from a relatively short period of time. So if you are attending live but you attended late. So if you weren't here at the very beginning, you might not have seen a link to that Jamboard. So I will just very quickly pop it again in the chat in case you weren't here at the very beginning. So feel free to have a play with that, and I'll share the link at the very end as well. So we've got something to collectively take away. So, okay, so the third topic, so we've talked a bit about visual thinking, a little bit about storytelling, I mean, so much more we could say. Gamification. So my first question is, what is it for anyone that doesn't know or anyone that hasn't heard of it?
Me to take that one, Paddy?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it,
Grant. Well, I'll start you chipping. So I think when I was looking at gamification, I came across there's 2 angles as I understand it. So there's gamification in terms of how you introduce rewards and incentives like you would in a computer game, and you weave that into your work. I think in the context that Paddy and I have been talking about gamification and workshops, it's more in the context of things like game storming and innovation games, where you're using games and collaborative play to kind of spark creativity and idea creation, that kind of thing. So when I think of games in this context, I'm talking about the latter, really, the driving innovative thinking by introducing games and things to spark creativity.
And just to add to that, so from what I've seen as well, I mean, the term gamification was coined up in the early 2000s, and it was really used to describe a process of adding game-like mechanics. So you know, some of those aspects of reward, etc. You know, people, roles, etc. To a non-gaming experience where we want to perhaps change the behavior or help change behaviors. So yeah, that's kind of my understanding in terms of bringing gamification into business and you know what that means.
Yeah, and because I guess when I think of gamification, I think about things like I listen to Audible a lot, and Audible you get badges. And when I started listening to Audible, I'm like, well, I don't care about the badges. And it turns out I really care about the badges after you start listening to it quite a lot, right? So how can I mean, Paddy or Grant, can either of you give an example of how, whether it's that type of definition of gamification or a broader definition, how we can build it into our work in a sort of business context?
Yeah, if I just go ahead with, I guess, first of all, some of the experiences I had at Deutsche Bank, my previous organization. So something that we were really keen to do was sort of give people a really good experience when they were learning agile or you know, it doesn't have to be agile, it could be anything. But for us, the focus was rolling out this agile education. And one of the things we had in there was a simulation. So often we see lots of agilists doing lots of Lego stuff. They play with Lego. But what we wanted to try and do was add an element of competition, competitiveness, because what we wanted to try and bring into the experience was this notion of teams. Although we want them to collaborate, we wanted to almost sort of take them down a route which would encourage them not to collaborate. So add in an element of competition. And so what we did was we started adding some of the mechanics of gaming into there. So things like points. So they had to build a product with Lego. Now, what they didn't know, they were all building the same product across multiple teams. So they were building a city, which all had different aspects to it. But then we added what we call value points into the mechanics of the game. And the idea was to maximize value. So every team assumed that meant they all have to individually as teams build as much as they can, regardless of what anyone else is doing. So just by adding a small extra bit of, you know, enhancement to that simulation, it encouraged this other behavior, this selfish behavior. You know, the teams didn't want to help each other. They just focused on their own achievements. And it's amazing what an impact that has. And pretty much, you know, 9 times out of 10, I rarely saw a group of people that thought, actually, let's all work together. Let's all maximize value together. So just by adding a simple dynamic into that experience really, really changed the whole dynamic. Another quick example, then I'll let Grant jump in with some. I had a group in India, and it was a group that we were training, and a colleague of mine, Kerry Nichols, we tried to make the session really engaging. And unfortunately, this one session, I don't know why, it got to lunchtime, and we were really struggling. We felt like the group were a little bit flat. Maybe it was the energy level. I don't know what it was. And so I had this crazy idea over lunchtime. I came back in and I just started putting numbers against the different teams, random numbers like 2,000 for one team, 3,000 for another team. And as soon as everybody sat down, their focus was on the numbers. And one brave soul, they put up their hand and they say, hey, what are those numbers? And I said, those are the points based on your activities this morning.
Wow.
And it just opened up this huge debate in the room, and people were starting to argue to say, well, hang on, why have they got more than us? And what were the rules? You didn't tell us the rules. And I just acted like, you know, the sort of as if, you know, I was a person making up the rules. So whatever I say goes. So I said, look, it's my opinion, and the points are my opinion. So these are the points. Oh my God, after that, every activity, they were super engaged and they became super competitive, which was amazing. And that dynamic in the room totally switched. And there's this one young girl, she kept complaining that her team only had 6 people, whereas everyone else had more people. And she kept saying 6, 6, 6. So I named her 6. And by the end of it, I was calling her 6, and it became this ongoing joke in the room. But it was amazing. It just changed that whole dynamic of that group. So just goes to show the power of it.
Interesting. Yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it? It's like there is an element of, I guess, competitiveness built into many people, you know, wanting to collect things, or, you know, wanting to complete, like, I don't know, probably as kids we all collected something, and part of the fun of collecting something was collecting it, and then kind of when you had a complete set, it was not as interesting. It's the thrill of the chase type of thing. So Grant, do you have any other examples to add?
Well, I think I don't think I've got any examples as good as Paddy's around actual gamification and introducing that behaviour in the way that Paddy described. But the aspect that I was talking about is more about using games to drive innovation and creativity, which I kind of alluded to in the bottom right of my picture when I was drawing people collaborating and externalising their thoughts. That's kind of where I've had more exposure to it. So things like, you know, empathy mapping as a way of trying to understand your users is a great example of that, where just a simple template and a few prompts, and then let people go at it and let them have the conversation, and they react to what each other says. And that sparks that creative process, and it helps you uncover things that you just wouldn't do if you tried to just sit down and write a list of requirements. You wouldn't get the same output.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's try and just answer as many of the remaining questions as we can before we wrap up, because we are starting to approach time. I mean, fascinating set of topics here. So our next question comes from Hertja, and Hertja says, "Hi, this is Hertja. Lovely session so far. I'll start with an easy question. Tips on how to start storytelling when the subject is it might actually be boring, and also the audience thinks that drawings are for children." And that's an interesting objection, isn't it? That sometimes if you're in that environment where it's like, what are you showing me this for? You know, I can't take that seriously. Any thoughts about overcoming that barrier?
I mean, in my experience, having worked in some fairly conservative organisations, I've never really had that level. I know it's a natural reaction when you look at the style, but when you're drawing on a whiteboard, people know it's not art. They know it's not a finished piece of work, if that makes sense. They understand that you're trying to produce a visual as a means to an end. You know, you're not trying to produce a pretty poster or whatever it might be. So I've never directly experienced that objection. I don't know about yourself, Paddy. Have you had an experience where you've kind of had that?
I mean, I think the litmus test for me was working for a big global bank, a German bank, which I had all sorts of stereotypes about.
Yeah, exactly.
And spending 6 years there. And I have to say, when I introduced things like play, Lego, you know, things that were seen as a no-no, like if you talk to people back then, you know, people like, you can't do that. And then having done it, you know, I had MDs asking to come on our training because they wanted to be part of that, and they wanted that experience. I didn't experiment so much with visualization back then, but I'm pretty sure, like, if we'd switched it out, it would have been absolutely fine. I've more recently done a couple of training sessions for large groups. So I had a group of about 60 people. I literally had a day and a half with these folks. I wasn't allowed to unmute them. I wasn't allowed to speak to them. There were lots of security issues. And I spent a day and a half sketching, literally sketching and talking. And the feedback was phenomenal, you know, and this was an organization that I would never have ever pictured as a visual thinking organization. Like they just traditionally have never been known for that. So I would say, let's break those stereotypes and try.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic way of looking at it, isn't it? It is that actually sometimes it's like, just show them. And maybe don't even tell them you're going to do it. You know, and I know it's the old cliche, and we've all heard this a million times. But ask for forgiveness, not permission. Like, you know, you're not going to get sacked for drawing on a whiteboard, whether that's a real whiteboard or visual whiteboard. And frankly, if you are, then do you really want to work for that organisation to start with? So definitely, you know, it's great to just do it and show the value. This is a question specifically about tools. I think it's about drawing tools. Are there any non-Apple tools available? I'm absolutely certain there are, but I'm wondering whether Grant and Paddy, you are both Apple users, so might not know the answer to that.
I am 100% Apple user, so yeah, it's not my strong point. I know there's an app that called Concepts that I think you can get a Windows version. I think that's one that I've heard of, but I've got no direct experience. I've used Apple for years now.
Yeah, I haven't got much to add, to be honest. I mean, Procreate has been my go-to for kind of sketchnoting and creating things. But I mean, to be fair, it really doesn't matter about the tool. As long as you have a drawing tool that allows you to do things like layering, so you can have layers, a little bit of color. You can literally use any. I wouldn't say it's tool specific.
That's it, and you know, and it is easy, isn't it, to sort of think, oh right, I need to do this. So what you know, the tool becomes the thing, but actually it's the and as you say, you know, pen and paper with the you know, with the cameras is really effective.
And it depends how far you're trying to take your visuals as well. You know, we've been kind of making the point that this isn't about art; it's about understanding and communicating ideas. Pretty much I would imagine any piece of drawing software that allows you to make a mark and add some colour, you can probably use.
Definitely. So just a couple of things before we do close. Richard says that Penny runs a one-day graphics course, which I've done, and which has taken me from being a complete non-drawer to somebody who now does basic drawing in real time in workshops. So that's worth us keeping in mind. And in fact, ironically, I was booked on Penny's workshop this summer, but it got cancelled because everything got cancelled. So I'm looking forward to finding that out myself as well. And lots of nice sort of thank yous going in the chat as well. So we really must end there. Now, before we conclude, Grant and Paddy, I'm absolutely certain that people will want to stay in touch with you. They'll want to know more about what you do. They'll want to follow you. What's the best way for people to stay in touch, and how can people sort of interact with you? So, Paddy, how can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big social media kind of, you know, expert. I pretty much use LinkedIn is my go-to. So feel free to link in with me. And we will be sending a link, hopefully, afterwards. And Adrian was kindly offered to share the link for our meetup, which is the Visual Jam. So I'd love for people to attend that, and yeah, just contact me through LinkedIn.
Definitely. So we'll include a link to your LinkedIn and, of course, the Visual Jam as well. Grant, if people want to stay in touch with you.
So again, you can find me on LinkedIn. I am a bit more active on Instagram, as my company name is Scarlett with 2 T's _solutions, and on Twitter as GW_Wright. And like Paddy said, I'd love people to kind of come along and join in with the Visual Jam. I think our next session is the 16th of September, and we've got Dave Mastronardi, who's the CEO of the Game Storming Group, joining us. So all this gamification stuff we've been talking about is bang on topic.
I mean, that's just amazing that you're just fantastic.
I can't believe some of the guests we're managing to land, to be honest. I'm really pleased.
Oh, awesome. Well, Grant, Paddy, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening and your busy schedule. I mean, I just know from the comments that are coming in that people have really, really found this valuable. And I mean, you know, I've found it valuable as well. It's always an absolute pleasure to talk and learn from you folks. Also, a massive thank you to everyone who is attending live, or indeed who is watching the recording. If you are attending live, would love it if you could complete a brief feedback survey. That's going in the chat now as well. It'll also be sent to you via email. There's like 3 questions. One of the questions is, what topics would you like us to cover? And these BA community webinars are really about focusing not necessarily on the core of business analysis, but stuff on the edges that's interesting. So If you've got ideas, type them in. I'll try and make it happen. Even better, if you're thinking, I've got a topic and I'd like to speak about it, that's fantastic. Put your details in there and I'll contact you and we can definitely make that happen. We got some other amazing webinars coming up. They are starting to sell out now, which is always really pleasing. And this was a really popular webinar. It really did sell out. We've got the fantastic David Beckham, not the footballer, of course, but the BA, which is much, much better, talking about things we might have to give up to learn. We might need to give up some of our previous preconceptions to learn as BAs. So Traveling Light, the baggage-free BA with David Beckham. You've got the link there, so get that one. That's actually very full already. Then the following week, this one's just been announced, so you've probably got a bit more time to register for this one. Thriving in Change, the art of self-leadership for change professionals. Because whether or not we know it, we are all leaders in some capacity or another. So do click through on those, register while they're still available. But if you do miss them, there'll be the recording, of course, but always better to attend live because you get to ask questions. So thank you so much, Paddy and Grant, for a fantastic session. Thank you everyone for attending live. Hope to see you all on a webinar or eventually real world event sometime soon. So very, very good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you all.
Bye.